Welcome back to Missing. I am Tim here today with Lance. Lance, how are you today?
I'm doing fantastic today, Tim. Hope all of our listeners are doing just as fantastic as I'm doing. And really happy to welcome back a recurring guest on the show. She's a great researcher, and she's bringing to the table one of those stories that I'd heard of in name, but never really dove too deep into until now. And it really does push the limits of my imagination in terms of what the heck happened here.
Yeah, it really does. And that guest you mentioned is Christy Arnhart. She is great. She has been on several times before, also on Crawlspace as well. So you want to check out Crawlspace for some of her appearances there. So these 5 young men were all traveling together. That's Gary Mathias, who is still missing, Bill Sterling, Jack Huett, Ted Weiher, and Jack Madruga. And the mysteries within this one case are vast.
Just as vast as the Plumas National Forest, in which they found their abandoned car. Pretty much the last thing that they found before finding bodies. And these 5 men were also afflicted with mild intellectual disabilities, which adds to the tragedy and just makes it that much more sad to think about what was going on in their decision-making during the last few moments.
And this case is from 1978 in Yuba, California. And I think we do a pretty good job here with Christy in this conversation to unpack all of the mysteries in this one story. But we're going to go even deeper on our subscription show, which we do weekly. And you can get that at Missing Premium. And you can check Missing Premium out on Apple Podcasts, or if you're not an Apple user, you can go to missing.supportingcast.fm, and you get ad-free episodes, that weekly bonus show, and early releases.
And Tim, you just mentioned the subscription service. I noticed that you did not mention the social media links. Where can one go to stay up to date with everything that's happening social media-wise?
Well, our listeners can find us on social media at MissingCSM. Thanks a lot for listening, everybody. We're going to break quick for commercial here, and we'll be right back with Christy Arnhart. Welcome back to the podcast, Christy Arnhart. Christy, how are you today?
Good. How are you guys doing?
Doing fantastic. It's always a great time welcoming you back on the show because you bring this information to the table that we've just spoken about before we started recording. This particular story that we're covering today was something that I think both of us didn't realize. Tim and I didn't realize that we had heard all of these nuggets out there, but it was never really put together in a narrative like this. An incredible mystery. So thank you for joining, and thank you for such a good job with this, with laying this out for us.
Well, thank you. It's a pleasure.
Great. Okay. So how's everything been since our last recording?
Just staying busy all the time. I don't have any new updates, unfortunately, but...
Okay. Well, this mystery that you brought us today is the Yuba County 5. This is quite a mysterious case. Can you tell us some of the basics of this mystery?
Oh, sure. It took place February 24th of 1978, and you've got 5 friends who are excited to go to a basketball game at California State University. And if it's one thing that these boys loved, it was basketball. Well, they were known around town as the boys, and it was 5 young men that lived in Yuba, California. You've got 25-year-old Gary Mathias, 29-year-old Bill Sterling, 24-year-old Jack Huett, 32-year-old Ted Weiher, and 30-year-old Jack Madruga. Now, Huett was the young man out of the group. Everybody in this group had some type of mental handicap or another that held them back slightly. Huett was the youngest. He lived with his family, just as all of the other boys did. Like Sterling, he had a slight intellectual disability, and it affected his learning, his problem solving, and judgment, as well as like common daily activities such as communication and independent living. Now, even though Huett was slow to respond when he was talked to, he was close friends with Weiher, and followed him everywhere that he went. Weiher looked after him like a protective brother would. You know, they relied on each other so much that when Huett had to make a phone call, which is something he really did not like to do, Weiher would go and dial the phone for him. They sound cute. Then you've got Sterling, who was deeply religious. He spent a lot of time at the library reading religious texts. He hoped that one day he could help bring Jesus to patients in mental hospitals through his research. Then you've got Weiher and Madruga, and they're considered the slow learners of the group. It was hard for them to learn necessary skills. They could do it, but it happened at a slower rate than the rest of us. They needed more time and repetition to learn the things that they were learning. They also had some problems with reasoning skills, and it was hard for them to learn new concepts. So, they can be taught. It takes time and patience. Now, as an example, Weir was so tenderhearted that if he waved to somebody on the sidewalk and they didn't wave back, he'd worry about it all day because he couldn't understand why they hadn't. And two, one of the things that he loved to do was to call Sterling on the telephone and read odd names that he'd found in the newspaper and the telephone book, and the two of them would laugh at it. So that leaves us with Mathias. Now, like Madruga, Mathias had spent some time in the army while he was stationed in West Germany in the 70s, unfortunately, he developed a drug problem. So his time spent in recovery gave doctors the time to diagnose him, and they found that he actually was suffering from schizophrenia. Now, once he was diagnosed, he got a psychiatric discharge from the army, and he went home to live with his parents. He had a tough time at first because he had to deal with his medication. And they don't always work the first time. You might have to try different combinations. While he was trying to get that straightened out, he had several run-ins with the police for assault. He didn't get arrested, but he very nearly did. And he had several psychotic episodes that eventually put him into the Veterans Administration Hospital. But now, once he came out, he adjusted to his medication. He was working with his stepfather at their gardening business, and everything had been going great. That's our boys, and that's what they were going to be doing that night.
And you said that they were well liked in the community. They were known as the boys, and didn't seem to be any indication that they had made any enemies in their community. Had they grown up together? Did they go to school together? Was this a result of them just being present in the community for a long time?
I didn't find anything that said they grew up together or attended school, but I know that through, like Special Olympics and things like that, they were able to meet people who were like them and keep in touch. So it wouldn't surprise me if they had all just met because of their learning disabilities.
Right. And they were all on the same basketball team.
Yes, they were. They were the Gateway Gators.
Very cool.
Yeah.
And I can't imagine that coming up with a combination of medication to treat schizophrenia back then in the mid to late 70s was as successful as it might be today. Or,
no.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, that poor dude, Mathias, you said, right? He was the one that suffered from schizophrenia.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there must have been a period of months where he wasn't getting the right combination.
Yeah, I can't imagine what that was like because they didn't even have the options that we do now. I bet that was a hard time for him.
Yeah. Kind of fortunate that after leaving the Veterans Hospital, he had his medication regimen down where it was working. So,
yes.
Little miracle there.
Yes, absolutely. Something that the boys were, they actually had two things that week that they were very excited about. One was going to the big ball game. The second was on the 25th, the Gators were going to play their first game in a week-long tournament for the Special Olympics. The winner got to take a free trip to LA. And I mean, these boys wanted that badly. So they were really looking forward to this trip. But before they could take their trip, they were going to the big ball game the night before. So they piled up into Madruga's 1969 Mercury Montego, and they took off out of town. It's cute because all the parents were trying to watch after him. Weir's grandmother got on to him because he didn't wear a coat. I can just imagine that these boys were a lot of fun to see as they played and worked around each other. But so they go to the game. They have a good night. Their favorite team wins. And about 10 o'clock, they drive a short distance away to Bears Market in downtown Chico. Chico is actually about an hour from where they lived. So the attendant at the market remembers the boys because she was closing up for the night and it irritated her that they came in at the last minute. But they come in, they bought snacks, sodas, and milk. And from there, she watched them pull out and drive south out of Chico, making that hour-long drive home. Now, unfortunately, they didn't make it because the next morning at 5 a.m., Weir's mother woke up and realized he wasn't home and his bed hadn't been slept in. So she called Sterling's mother, asking if he was there. He wasn't. This set off a whole chain reaction of phone calls all over town. Before the parents actually found out none of these boys came home, we've got a problem. So they called police and got police on it.
When they stopped at this market in Chico, was the attendant familiar with them before, or?
No.
Okay. So when the attendant was presented with photos of them, that's when this person had said, yes, these were the people that were in here. So what I'm saying is, like, it's pretty certain that it was them.
Yes, it was. So on the 25th, authorities start searching. They drove down the route that the boys would have taken from the ball game to get home. They found nothing. They searched for a few days, and on the 28th, 70 miles away, a forest ranger in Plumas National Forest found the Montego abandoned out there. Had no keys, and it was setting along a forest road, almost like a logging road. Now, the car was stuck in a snowdrift, and evidence showed that the wheels had spun trying to get the car out, but for some reason, they just abandoned it. Officers could see that the car was not badly stuck, and these 5 guys could have easily got out and just pushed it right out of the drift it was in. They got to thinking, well, maybe their car broke down or they ran out of gas. So they get in there, they jump the car. It starts up just fine. There's nothing wrong with it. And there's still a quarter of a tank of gas in the car.
Interesting. Okay. So, yeah, that area can definitely have some unexpected snow at times.
Oh, yes.
So I guess that must have been what happened.
Yes.
I mean, they were only about an hour driving distance away from where they lived. Seems pretty spontaneous, but it's definitely that kind of thing definitely happens.
Yes, it does.
The vehicle, the Montego, is this the Mercury Montego, the sedan, like the 4-door sedan?
Yes.
And obviously, Madruga's disabilities don't impact his driving
Right.
or his ability to drive.
Right. I think he was the only one out of the group who could.
Okay.
Now, when the officers searched around and in the car, they didn't find any evidence of foul play. They found 4 neatly folded state maps in the glove box, and they found the empty food wrappers from the stuff that they had bought in Chico the night before. So they got to thinking, well, did the boys come up here because this was an area they knew? When they questioned the family, every one of them said they had no idea why the boys would drive out this way and end up there. Madruga's parents said that he didn't like the cold weather, and he cared about his car so much that he would have never voluntarily driven the car down that logging road, and he wouldn't have let anyone else do it either.
How far away from the store was this?
They actually found the car 70 miles away.
From the store.
Yeah.
So it's not really close. It seems like they drove almost about half of the way from Chico back to Yuba City, but then ended up taking a turn and going northeast instead of southwest.
And ended up on some unknown logging road.
So I just want to get the geography straight in my own head. Their car was found 70 miles away in Plumas National Forest, and they were coming from Chico, from the market in Chico.
It almost seems like they must have taken a wrong turn somewhere.
You would think so.
Yeah, Chico is almost due north of Yuba City, and so they could have gone direct south, but they ended up so far away from where they were intending to go.
Yeah. And I know that they were familiar with Chico and driving there. So that wasn't new to them. It's not like, they got confused. Oh my gosh. Because they had done that before.
So I just want to be clear on the geography and maybe a couple of options or a couple of decisions that they had to make when they left the store in Chico, because it seems like Yuba City, right? That's where they were. That was their destination, correct?
To go home, yes.
To go home. So Yuba City is south of Chico, and Plumas National Forest is almost directly east, maybe a little bit northeast. It's almost a 3-hour car ride from Chico to Plumas National Forest, just looking at a map right now. I don't know what roads were open or closed back then. Maybe some of them were detoured because of the weather, but it's not even in the correct direction of Yuba. It's like they just literally took a wrong turn and didn't realize they were going east instead of south.
Yeah, that's what it seems like. And it's so unusual because it's so far out of the way. But, I mean, maybe they were just having fun talking and didn't realize.
So the Montego was found abandoned without its keys along this forest road. So no accident, and it started up right away, and the car probably could have been pushed back to an area where it was out of the snowdrift.
It could have been, yeah. I think there would have been tracks, though, wouldn't there? Unless snow had covered it up, because it was snowing.
Right.
Yeah.
So I guess one part of the mystery is why did the car end up there, and why did they leave the car? I would say is the second part of that mystery.
Exactly, especially with the snow and whatnot. You'd be better off with the car.
And there's 5 of them, so one of them could have been driving, the other 4 could have been pushing. Difficult for me to think that none of them had that idea.
It is for me, too. I'm telling you, nothing about this case makes sense to me.
So the gas tank showed it was still a quarter full as well.
Yes.
And when they stopped at that market, do we know if they got gas there, if they filled up?
Nothing was said about gas, just that they went in, bought their snacks, and headed out.
Okay, and in, I guess, taking that wrong turn or spending the night elsewhere, they put their basketball game in jeopardy that they were supposed to have the next day.
Yeah, and that's something that their parents say they would have never done. They had all worked hard for that, and they were really looking forward to it. They wouldn't have put that in jeopardy.
Wow. Okay, was anyone familiar with the area that the car ended up in?
Yes, vaguely, yes. Sterling had visited the area with his father on a fishing weekend, but he didn't enjoy the trip and didn't like the area, so they never went back.
Do we know what it was about the area that he didn't like?
No, and it could have been just as simple. It was too far of a walk, or there was too much wilderness.
Interesting. And it's also interesting that in the glove box were the state maps. Can you get into that a little bit?
Well, there was nothing else said about it, just that there were 4 in the glove box. They were all neatly folded. They didn't look like they'd been opened or used. I know my dad used to carry, a huge book of maps with him and all kinds of stuff way back before we had phones that could do it for us. So maybe this was just a case of him being prepared.
4 state maps. So if they decided to leave, they had the wherewithal to take their keys. Why wouldn't you take a map?
I don't know. And why would you leave the car when you're not dressed for the weather? One of the boys didn't even have a jacket.
Weird.
Very.
I don't like it. I don't like what's happening here, Christy.
Well, and to make it worse, when they towed the car in and examined it, they noticed that there was absolutely no damage on the underside of the car. And if you're driving down a logging road, you're constantly bouncing, you're hitting things. When they looked, they said that the low-hanging muffler in the back didn't have any mud, scrapes, or anything on it that showed it had been driven down that road. So whoever did take it down there drove it very carefully, which makes you think that, it was Madruga driving.
Yeah, I agree there.
Well, the search was a long one. They had helicopters. They had people on horseback. They searched for 2 days in the snow before another snowstorm hit. And they almost lost 2 snowcats then. So they had to stop. And they decided that they would wait to do another proper search once the spring thaw had hit. I guess at this point they thought, this many days out here, surely the boys are not in good condition. But during that time, the family didn't stop. They offered a reward for information, but those leads didn't pan out. They had a water witcher from a nearby town come in who said he could modify his dowsing rod to pick up human remains instead of water. Now, his search led them to an empty cabin out there, but there was no evidence the boys had ever been there. Now, they consulted psychics. One psychic claimed that the boys had been kidnapped and taken to another state. That claim was never verified. Another told investigators that the boys had been murdered in nearby Oroville, gave a description of the house, gave the address, and it took them 2 days to figure out that this house didn't exist. So thank you so much, fake psychics.
They disappeared on February 24th. And now we have the Water Witcher and the Psychics coming in, and this is still like the first week in March.
Well, a lot of things are happening fast here.
That's impressive that word traveled so fast.
Well, and I don't know, being small towns, maybe, everybody was talking about this. Everybody was trying to help. So there's no telling how quickly all that came.
Do you know if it made national news at the time too?
I don't know.
Yeah, 5 people disappearing at once. I wouldn't be too surprised if it had. That's pretty unusual.
And we'll be right back after a quick word from our sponsors.
Thanks to our sponsors, and now we're back to the program.
So a couple other leads. One saw the boys in Ontario. Another saw them at a movie theater in Sacramento, but neither of those leads led to anything. There were only actually 2 leads that police followed that stuck out to them the most. Now, the first one came in on March 3rd, and this was from a woman who worked at a local convenience store. She claimed that on the 25th of February, 5 men in a 1950s model red pickup truck stopped at the store. 2 of the men, who she identified as Weiher and Huett, used the telephone booth in front. 2 men stayed in the truck, and the 5th came into the store, made some purchases, and then left. The owner pretty much corroborated what she said, but there were some minor differences. He claimed that when the men stopped, it was Weiher and Huett who came into the store and bought the soft drinks, burritos, and chocolate milk. Police believe that the woman's claims were credible even with the inconsistencies, but it didn't escape their notice that she didn't call in the encounter until after the family offered a reward for information. It's also odd, too, because Weiher and Huett would be the least likely ones to use a telephone. So I don't know how. I just really don't know. The car doesn't match. I don't know how credible that is. I really don't.
It's not close, right? It's a red pickup, it's described as.
Yeah, a 1950s red pickup.
And that's a lot different from the car they were driving.
It is. It is. That one, I don't know. I just don't really buy that one.
And just to be clear, this is Ontario, California, not Ontario, Canada, correct?
Yes, you're correct.
Yeah, Ontario, California, quite a distance from where these boys were known to be. Ontario, California is just east of Los Angeles. So unless they had planned on skipping that tournament and winning that trip to Los Angeles and just gone, I would call that report very unlikely.
I would too. That one, nah, I'm not buying that one. The second one seems more credible, but it's just as unusual as everything else with this case. The second sighting comes from a man named Joseph Shones. Now, Shones drove from Sacramento to the National Forest to check on the conditions before he brought his family up to their cabin for a ski weekend. At about 5:30 p.m. on the 24th, the night that the boys disappeared, he was about 150 foot down the road from his cabin in his Volkswagen, heading home. So he was leaving the cabin, headed back, when he got stuck in the snow. Now, when he got out to try and push the car free, he started to have a heart attack. So he left the car running so he would have heat going, and he just climbed into the back seat and laid down to see if the heart attack would subside because, he couldn't get anywhere. He had no way to call anyone. 6 hours later, he's still in a lot of pain, and he's still in the back of the car, but he hears what he describes as a whistling noise coming from down the road. He hoped that it was somebody that could help him. So, he climbed out of the car. Walking his way, backlit by the headlights of their vehicle, whatever it was, he couldn't even tell what the vehicle was a group of men, along with a woman who was carrying a baby. Now, when he heard their voices, he started calling for help, but the voices stopped and the lights of the vehicle went out. He couldn't see or hear anything else, so he just climbed back in the car.
Very strange, yeah. Almost strikes me as a hallucination.
Well, you would think so, yes.
Yeah.
6 hours in pain.
6 hours of having a heart attack.
Yeah, I can't imagine. I would start to hallucinate.
I don't want to totally write it off as a hallucination, but it does feel like a heavenly figure, right? It feels like some backlit by the headlights and a woman carrying a baby and a group of men. It feels something that's very Oasis. You know, you're in the desert and you see the Oasis.
Yeah, it does. I hadn't thought about it like that, but it does.
But you're having a heart attack. Terrifying.
I know. I know. Twice that night, he claimed he saw flashlight beams outside his window. After he'd call for help, the flashlight beams would turn off. So I don't know if that's another part of the hallucination or if there are just people out there and about. I don't know. During the height of his pain, he claimed that a pickup truck parked about 20 feet behind him before it just pulled back out and left going down the road. That encounter, the police did discount because at this point he admitted that he might be having hallucinations. So it's not a stretch to assume that he was having hallucinations to begin with.
Yeah.
But there could have been random people out that night, I guess. You wouldn't think so with the snow and everything, but I guess it's a possibility.
He was out.
Yeah, he was. Now, by morning, his car had run out of gas and his heart attack had subsided enough that he could go ahead and walk 8 miles to a local lodge called Mountain House where he could get some help. All night with a heart attack and you walk 8 miles the next morning, that really shows you how people survive.
8 miles.
Yes.
Talk about resolve. I can't imagine it feels like my heart attack is doing a little better. I'll give walking a shot.
I mean, you have to. Otherwise, you're going to freeze to death out there in your car. I just can't imagine having to do it. It really takes some resolve.
Jesus.
Now, what was interesting was, not far along his walk, in the area where he was hearing voices the night before, he saw the boys' Montego abandoned. So it was somewhere nearby him, and it's possible he heard voices. I don't know about the car coming down the road and the woman with the baby and whatnot, but he could have been confusing what he was hearing with, a hallucination.
I don't know. I mean, knowing that the Montego was close by, and then he sees a truck. If we're discounting hallucinations, they were seen in a truck later on. That was one of the reports, right? That was one of the sightings.
Yes.
Maybe they all hopped into this truck because the car was stuck and this truck had happened to be there.
Where's the owner of the truck?
Maybe it's the woman and the baby.
That's true. Could have been. And she just let them borrow the truck maybe to go to the convenience store and get snacks, if that one holds up as well.
Also, there's 5 plus the woman and the baby in the truck, a pickup truck.
Yeah, I'm not seeing that.
That's crammed, unless they're in the back.
Yeah, very crammed.
Could be in
the back during the snow, because they certainly could have.
Okay, but there is the fact that the Montego was found there. Definitely
Yes.
there. That's not a hallucination.
Definitely. Nope.
Okay.
Not a hallucination at all.
Okay, so he saw it when he was walking by. Is that what he said?
Yes. Yes, on his
Okay.
way back to the lodge, he saw it. And he said it wasn't far from his car.
And he saw it abandoned, and that was before it was found when it launched the search.
Right.
Interesting. Okay.
Now we're headed into spring. They can finally start doing all of the searches that they had wanted to do during the winter. On June 4th, a group of motorcyclists traveling the area that the Montego was found in stopped at a trailer that was maintained by the Forest Service. Had a campsite. It was off the road, something people could use. They could see that one of the front windows was broken, but what they found inside, still to this day, just boggles the mind. When the front door was opened, they were met with the smell of decay and soon found a body inside. That body belonged to Weiher. He was now 20 miles from the abandoned car.
Wow, very strange.
That's not even the weirdest part of this. Investigators found Weiher laying on a bed covered from head to toe with 8 bed sheets. On a bedside table, they found his wallet with his cash in it, a nickel ring with Ted engraved onto it, and a necklace he was known to wear. Beside his personal effects was a gold watch that didn't contain its crystal, and then there was a partially melted candle sitting beside it. Now, also found in his possessions was his handheld diary notepad. It looks like the last entry in the notepad are, "We are number 1. Our basketball tournament is Saturday, February 25th at 9:30 at Sierra College in Sacramento. Gateway Gators," with an exclamation point. Now, people argue about what this note actually says. Some of them it says, we are lost. Nobody can really decide. When I looked at it, what I read to you is what I think it says.
If you're saying that instead of we're number one, it says we are lost, then it reads we are lost. Our basketball tournament is Saturday, 25th at 9:30 in Sierra College in Sacramento, Gateway Gators.
Mm-hmm.
I kind of think it says lost.
You do?
I do, but it's very hard to read.
It is.
It's like the only word that's really hard to read.
I know, and it's the most controversial part of it.
So the other items that were found with his body all belong to him, or were there items that didn't belong to him? And was there any way that, like how long he had been there?
Well, all of the items were verified to be his except for the watch. No one in the group owned it, and the families couldn't identify it. He was still wearing his velour suit, light pants from the night of the ball game, but his shoes were nowhere to be found. Now, an autopsy showed that from the growth of his beard, he'd lived for 13 weeks after he disappeared. His feet were gangrenous and frostbitten, and he'd lost nearly 100 pounds before dying from a combination of starvation and hypothermia. The cabin, the Forestry Service has set this up for people to use in times of need. A fire was never started, even though there were matches and lots of paperback novels that you could have started a fire with. A nearby storage shed showed that the sea ration cans in it had been opened and consumed, but the larger locker in the same shed that contained even more of those rations, it was untouched. Even the warm forestry clothing that they had back there was untouched. So why would you do that? Why would you eat one out of one locker but not another? Why wouldn't you use what was set there, whether it was your cabin or not?
What would that put him at 13 weeks later? The 24th to...
It's like 3 months later.
Yeah. So he lived through the winter out there slowly starving, unfortunately.
Well, that makes no sense.
No, it doesn't.
So they were able to determine that he had lived for 13 weeks because of the growth of his beard.
Yes. I mean, they even had a butane tank in there that fed gas to the cabin, and they just left it unopened. All they had to do was open the valve, and it would have heated the cabin.
Now, was there any evidence that any of the other boys or men were there as well?
There are. They found Mathias's tennis shoes in the trailer and evidence that Huett was possibly there with him and Weiher, but they found nothing else. Now, the sea rations were opened using a P38 can opener, which would have been familiar to Mathias and Madruga through their stay in the military. Investigators felt that the boys must have stayed with Weiher, who was in so much pain from the gangrene, he wouldn't have been able to move much. So they think that they stayed with him until he passed away. And from there, they think Mathias took Weir's larger shoes to wear on his feet, which at the time, his feet must have been swollen and frostbitten as well. He wasn't, none of them were in good shape at this point.
And we'll be right back after a quick word from our sponsors.
Thanks to our sponsors, and now we're back to the program.
The next day, searchers started by examining the road between the trailer and the spot where the Montego was abandoned. 11.4 miles from the car, they found 2 bodies laying on opposite sides of the road. One was Madruga, whose body had been dragged 10 feet into a nearby stream and scavengers partially devoured it. He was laying face down with his right hand curled around his watch, and an autopsy showed that he died from hypothermia. Nearby that, scattered over 50 feet, are the remains of Sterling. Searchers only found his bones and the car keys. His cause of death couldn't be determined because with him being drug out, they just couldn't determine what the cause of death is. What they think happened is that they theorized that one of the men started to succumb to hypothermia and lay down to sleep, and the other simply just wouldn't leave his side until it was too late, and then he met the same fate too. Now, they did find Mathias's shoes in the woods, but they didn't find any sign of him. Now, 2 days after they discovered Madruga and Sterling, a separate search party went to search for any signs of Mathias and Huett. Unfortunately, while Huett's father searched a thick stand of manzanita bushes, he found the remains of his son, and it was 2 miles northeast of the trailer. Now, even though only his bones and clothes were found, it was theorized that he too had died of hypothermia. Their only other find was 3 forestry service blankets and a rusted flashlight that lay by the road about a quarter of a mile from the trailer, but they don't even know if that was theirs or not. That's just what they found.
So, according to the theory, the other men stayed with Weiher until he died, and according to the autopsy, he died about 13 weeks later.
Mm-hmm.
So they stayed with him for 13 weeks?
Well, I don't know that they stayed in the cabin for 13 weeks. What if some of this was just wandering out in the wilderness lost?
That's what it seems like, yeah.
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 That's what set him up for all the frostbite and everything else. Maybe once they got to the cabin, he was so bad off, they just put him in bed and sat with him until he passed. Only for them to get out and walk a little ways and go by hypothermia.
Mm.
After he passed?
Well, no, I'm sorry to say that. We don't know if it was after he passed because there were only partial remains on most of this. So, they were able to determine hypothermia on the one body by the creek, but they couldn't even determine on the other because he had been drug out. So,
and this Plumas National Forest, very, I don't want to call it abandoned, but very mountainous region here. Yeah, only imagine 100 miles or so.
I think it's just I can't wrap my head around 13 weeks. And
once you start laying out the timeline, it's so confusing.
Mm-hmm. What the hell were they doing there in the first place?
I don't know. Even for a wrong turn. I mean, even that seems to stretch. What you think? And what about Mathias?
Yeah, where did he end up?
What's happened with him? Now, his criminal history is known, because he was having trouble with his medications and whatnot. But could something have happened to him? Could he have had some kind of mental break, maybe with reality that the family didn't see? They've wondered, did he take them out there? Did he lead them around until they were all dead? Just, not even realizing he was doing something wrong. Maybe he took them out there and left them thinking they'd be okay with the supplies, which obviously they weren't.
And he was known to be schizophrenic?
Yes.
And I can't imagine he had his medication with him or
no, I would think he took it before he left. Living with his parents, they would have probably made sure that he was doing that.
Right. So after a certain amount of time, I don't know if it's a week or two, that's going to leave your bloodstream completely.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and there's no telling what he thinks after that happens.
Right. But by all accounts, he was on his medication when they went missing.
Yes, absolutely. And he was doing great.
Right. So his schizophrenia shouldn't have accounted for why they went missing.
No.
I could see him having some schizophrenic moments and maybe trying to leave the area to figure out, like, to know, like, I know a way out of here. And maybe he did. And maybe that's why it was kind of sporadic with the others, like, coming and going, maybe. Like, maybe they went out to go look for him or something. Because I don't think that, like, I think there would have been, like, a clear indication that he had caused them harm if he had a schizophrenic moment and caused them harm. I think there would be something that would indicate that, some sort of blunt force trauma on the head or on some remains. And the fact that he's not found, maybe he just kind of broke and took off and they were trying to find him. That's the only thing I can think of. This is not a comfortable one, Christy.
No, it's not. It deals with a lot of sad issues. And a lot of things that we only barely understand, unfortunately.
Yeah. What kind of crimes had he committed in the past?
Well, it was just, he was almost arrested on assault charges. Now, it didn't elaborate on those charges. It could have been that he had words with somebody in public. It could have even just been with his family. Because, you tend to be hardest on the people who love you and are taking care of you. So it could have been them. But no, it didn't elaborate as to what those were. Just that they were assault charges that he almost got. And see, you have to remember the only evidence found of Mathias were his shoes in the woods, nothing else. They didn't find his glasses, nothing. So, it seems unlikely that he would be able to start over in a new state, without his medication or anything like that. Unless his remains are still out there somewhere, he has never been accounted for.
Yeah, I'm guessing his remains probably are out there somewhere.
I've always felt like they were. I didn't,
Yeah.
maybe he led them astray for some odd reason, but I don't think that he intended to do all of this. I don't. And I do. I feel like he's out there in the woods somewhere too.
Yeah, he probably also wouldn't have gotten that far without his shoes. Not really clear why he would have taken them off, but
No, I mean, I know people with hypothermia will start to undress, but they didn't find any other evidence that he was there.
right. Yeah, I suppose no telling he was thinking straight at that time.
Yes, and, naturally, the family didn't feel that law enforcement did them right with this. I don't know if it was because of their disabilities or what the deal was, but none of the families felt like this case was investigated the way it should have. They've just got questions and no answers.
I guess it's easy to say like hypothermia and kind of close the books on it.
It is. Because I don't know, I never saw anywhere that he was cited in another state. But if the police weren't trying too hard to, get this out, the chances of someone hearing about it out of state wouldn't have been that great.
Just such vast wilderness. I can't get over just how large and kind of mountainous that area is.
It is. It is. It's one of those places I would definitely stick to the tracks and whatnot that were laid out. I would not be going out there trying to explore it all on my own. Even in fear, I'd probably just sit down where I was and wait for somebody to find me.
Has there been any furthering of any investigation, or it's pretty much closed?
No, it's closed. They don't really know what happened to them, but with everyone dying from hypothermia and having gangrene, things like that, I guess it was a natural assumption for the police that, yeah, he's probably still out there. And it's just so odd. It's so far
really
out
is.
of their way. Even just to start off that mystery, even if they took a wrong turn, how did they get so lost and then just walk off into the wilderness in the snow?
Yeah. The mysteries, they don't seem to make sense. I'm not sure if suggesting foul play makes any more sense. Do you know what I mean? Because it's definitely crossed my mind with the story with the red truck. Who knows what's going on? How did they end up out there? But I don't know. There's 5 of them. It just seems like that would be very tough to pull off.
Yeah, and especially with what they pegged them as dying from, the ones that they could.
Yeah.
No, I never felt like foul play was a part of it.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. It just seems like a whole comedy of errors, One
Yeah.
mistake led to another and another until you have this huge mystery.
I mean, how did they even make their way out into the trailer in the first place with the snow?
I'm assuming they just walked around aimlessly until they found it. I mean, my gosh, though, it was so far from the car.
Must have been terrifying just being alone in the wilderness, walking around for days or weeks even,
Yeah.
and no sign of anyone. And by that point, the search probably stopped for them.
Yeah. Yeah, because that next snowstorm came in fairly quickly, within the first 2 weeks, I think it was. So,
Must have been a weird feeling being with your friends out there like that, and then knowing there's all these people in the world, but none of them are near you, close enough to help.
well, and especially when you're used to having your family close all the
Yeah.
time. It must have just been terrible for them.
Yeah.
How far was the trailer from the car?
It was 20 miles from the abandoned car.
20 miles.
I wonder how long they were at the cabin. How long did they walk in the wilderness before they stumbled across the tracks or the cabin one?
It's got to be like days
Mm-hmm.
in those conditions.
Yes. I mean, I know how far I can do a 5K walking in an hour.
Mm-hmm.
So that's 3.5 miles. But in the snow and the cold and the forest and everything else, oh my gosh, I can't imagine. And they traveled so many miles.
You're probably walking in circles too at
Well,
times.
yeah, and I mean that would explain why one of them, his feet were gangrene.
It's so frustrating because they could have just pushed the car out.
I know. Or they could have just started a fire. There's so many little things.
Yeah. Started a fire, found the found the larger rations of food.
Yeah, and a lot of this stuff was within these boys' wheelhouse.
Hmm.
Even with the difficulties that they had, they were able to do some of these things. I mean, if they hadn't have found that cabin, they may not have ever found them.
Right. Yeah, you're probably right.
I mean, on the surface, it does. It looks like they took a wrong turn, got flustered, and took off walking. But when you take into account the sheer immensity of, the distances they were driving, the place they were at, it just throws it all into, a whole new perspective.
What a mysterious case.
It is. And it's held for all these years. And it's unusual. You would think by this time they might, if Mathias had made it out of there, maybe, he started somewhere else and started a new life. But there's no reports, there's no sightings, there's just nothing.
Well, Christy, this has been another head-scratching mystery. Or brain-scratching, should I say.
Oh, no. There's trademarks all over that.
John heard that. Yeah, it's definitely a head scratcher. You can just explain it off with little errors because of a disability or a misunderstanding, but like I said, the sheer immensity of all of it, the time spent, the miles traveled, everything, just, it boggles your mind.